In this hour or so, we will look at eugenics, the idea of deciding that we want certain kinds of babies and not others. We associate this idea with the Nazis, but it goes far beyond them. Let's begin in the 1890s. With the ideas of social Darwinism, which were very popular in the first Gilded Age. We're currently living in the second, in which wealth disparities are as large as they ever have been. And you have these extraordinarily really wealthy men, whom we now refer to in hindsight as the robber barons. J.P. Morgan in banking, Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, Henry Ford in cars, Andrew Mellon in banking, and they're making a great deal of money. And they're also paying their workers, obviously, as little as possible. And that raises an important question for society. Should there be laws enacted to protect poor people so that children shouldn't have to work 14-hour shifts in a mine or a sweatshop or a factory, so that if you're injured you don't have to starve to death? Yes, by golly, there should be some regulation of what employers can do to their employees. There should be some concept of rights for workers, and people should be able to earn a living wage at a job. But social Darwinism gives you the opposite answer, and consequently it was embraced by the rich and powerful. Let's go through their argument. There is now a law of nature, survival of the fittest. Herbert Spencer named it, and Charles Darwin agreed that it was the same as natural selection. Clearly the rich are more fit than the poor. That's how we got to where we are now, at the pinnacle of world domination, through the work of the fittest, the rich. Any assistance that we give to the poor would be survival of the unfit. That would go against nature. Therefore, we must not help the working poor, and we must keep government off the backs of the rich people. Well, by about 1910, this was recognized as a pretty vulgar appeal to nature on the part of people who had way too much money, and ideas about government and its role began to change. But these ideas began to take a different form with the invention of the field of genetics at the turn of the 20th century. And in the early part of the 20th century, eugenics began to supplant social Darwinism. They were similar in a lot of ways, but they had some interesting differences, and it's useful not to confuse them. Social Darwinism was simply about respecting the integrity of existing economic, political, and social hierarchies, because they are ultimately good, and now modern biology says so. Social Darwinism doesn't say anything about genetics or reproductive rates. It's just about the wealthy and powerful trying to rationalize their wealth and power. As a British paleontologist put it, "Justice belongs to the strong, and has been meted out to each race according to its strength. Each has received as much justice as it deserved. It is not priority of occupation, but the power to utilize, which establishes a claim to the land. Hence, it is a duty which every race owes to itself, and to the human family as well, to cultivate by every possible means its own strength, or else it incurs a penalty which natural selection, the stern but beneficent tyrant of the organic world, will assuredly exact, and that speedily to the full. Exploitation, colonialism, unbridled greed, good. Check. Eugenics will retain that part. Social stratification is good and natural. The haves deserve what they have. But we'll combine that with some real Darwinian data. The poor are outbreeding the rich. Well, if the poor are outbreeding the rich and the poor are inferior beings to the rich, then basic evolutionary theory shows that we're headed for an apocalypse. In the future, our nation will be populated by the genetically worst of our gene pool today. Immediately, we can see that it goes against the natural order again. The natural order is survival of the fittest. The poor are worse than the rich, but the poor are nevertheless outbreeding the rich. That's a subversion of nature that has to be changed, or else civilization is doomed. So what we need, say the eugenicists, is the government to intervene, to pass laws to help the genetic future of the American civilization. So where the social Darwinists were arguing for less government, the eugenicists are actually arguing for more government. The founder of the movement was Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, who wrote in 1883 about his desire to give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. Galton was famously an obsessive measurer of all things, and arguably invented modern statistics to make sense of it. Now, it's important to remember that in the late 19th century, the nature of the relationship between civilized and primitive people was still a bit of an open question. As Arthur de Gobineau, the father of scientific racism, put it in 1853, "So, the brain of the Indian contains in an undeveloped form an intellect which is absolutely the same as that of the Englishman or the Frenchman. Why then in the course of ages has he not invented printing or steam power? I should be quite justified in asking our Indian why, if he is equal to our European peoples, his tribe has never produced a Caesar or Charlemagne among its warriors, and why his bards and sorcerers have in some inexplicable way neglected to become Homers and Galens. It never occurs to him that not knowing the names of Native American warriors, poets, or healers might reflect his own ignorance, not theirs. Anyway, this is 1853. The Origin of Species is 1859. And in 1868, the leading German Darwinian, Ernst Haeckel, decides to take a stab at answering what is the nature of the relationship between primitive and civilized peoples. He pretty much agrees with Arthur de Gobineau that there is a basic difference between the brains of civilized and uncivilized people. And he formalizes this distinction at the very beginning of his 1868 book with these grotesque caricatures, showing that Europeans are related to primitive races in precisely the same way that primitive races are related to monkeys. That answer, however, did not go over particularly well in England. A year later, Darwin's friend and one of the leading biologists in England, Alfred Russel Wallace, makes a different stupid argument. And it goes like this. God intended for us to be civilized. Unlike the apes, all humans have the ability to be civilized, yet only some people are. Clearly that difference resides in the differences of the brain of human versus ape. An ape can't be civilized, a human can. Any human can. The brain of the savage is equal to the brain of the European, but natural selection cannot create an organ that has no use, argues Wallace. Therefore, the brain of the savage could not have been produced by natural selection, because savages are uncivilized and don't use their brains much. Natural selection could only have endowed the savage with a brain a little superior to that of an ape, whereas he actually possesses one but little inferior to that of the average members of our learned societies. We must therefore admit the possibility that in the development of the human race, a higher intelligence has guided the same laws for nobler ends. Civilization, argues Wallace, is essentially the result of a miracle. Wallace's argument is both ethnocentric and spiritual, but that's arguably better than racist. Meanwhile, Darwin writes to him, "I hope you have not murdered too completely your own and my child." Haeckel in 1868 didn't work. Wallace in 1869 didn't work. Let's give it one more shot. In 1871, Edward Tyler says that the difference between civilized and savage peoples has nothing to do with the spiritual or the racial. It's culture or civilization taken in its wide ethnographic sense, that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Tyler says that savages are fully human and use their brains fully. It's not an empty vessel that will only get filled up with civilization. It's that they use their brains differently and fill it up with other stuff. They aren't lower forms of life, they're lower forms of culture. Tyler will be inventing ethnocentrism as a counter-argument against racist genocide. And this will literally be the starting point of anthropology, the disconnect between inherent biological factors from cultural historical factors in explaining human society. And that, of course, will be Franz Boas's starting point in his book The Mind of Primitive Man from 1911. In short, historical events appear to have been much more potent in leading races to civilization than their faculty, and it follows that achievements of races do not warrant us in assuming that one race is more highly gifted than the other. But Boas, even though he has a doctorate in physics, is working against a strongly scientific biological argument in the early 20th century, which goes like this. The building blocks of life are genes. The genes make the brain, and the brain is where the mind comes from, and the ideas and the behaviors it produces. Therefore, bad ideas and behaviors are made by bad minds, which are made by bad brains, which are made by bad genes. This isn't rocket science, unfortunately. And now comes the Darwinian argument. Under nature's law, we bred principally from the top. Today we breed from the top and bottom, but more rapidly from the bottom. Assuming that there is a hierarchy of human value, and that we can identify it, it used to be survival of the fittest, but as the social Darwinists said, it isn't anymore. Now it's survival of the unfittest. And what the eugenicists add is the demographic genetic inference about the composition of the future population, given this differential reproduction, which is pretty much how we defined natural selection a few decades ago. In other words, it's a theory of biology. A stupid theory of biology, but a theory of biology nevertheless. And scientists are supposed to be our defense against that kind of stuff. And eugenics is interesting because it's a case where they warrant. This is about taking conscious control of the direction of civilization. It's modern and progressive. This is based on projections of differential reproduction, so it's Darwinian. So it's critical to understand the eugenics movement in the context of the politics of the time. If there is no income tax, and there is a small federal budget, and if you believe that large groups of people are innately inferior, and if you believe that the perceived good of the state or race should take precedence over the rights of the individual, and if you believe that the government should actively intervene in family matters, and finally that the government's role is to stimulate economic growth, even if some individuals or ethnic minorities or others get a little bit hurt in the process, then what does science say? And what science says is that given these bracketing political and moral ideas, we need to breed a better form of citizen by controlling the reproduction of the people of inferior quality. We will focus on the American eugenics movement, but it had different expressions in different countries. In the US and the UK, it was focused on race and class, a bit more race in the US and a bit more class in the UK. But in Latin America, eugenics was often used as an umbrella term for improved public hygiene programs and public health initiatives. In Germany, it was called race hygiene rather than eugenics, and also invoked public health, but as a metaphor. The lower races were reproducing like tumors throughout the national body. Ugh. In the Soviet Union, it came down to the basic materialist interest in the neuroanatomy of genius. And what they all shared was a progressive scientific interest in taking control of the future, controlling heredity by controlling families, and thereby leaving a mark on posterity. In England, where it began, eugenics got caught up in an academic catfight between William Bateson, whose life had been changed by the discovery of segregating Mendelian genes to such an extent that he named his first son Gregory after Mendel. Gregory Bateson later became a prominent anthropologist. And on the other side, Francis Galton's heir and statistical innovator Karl Pearson. Pearson became the leader of British eugenics and took it in a biometric direction. So William Bateson lost interest in it. Also, the Brits didn't do much in the way of national legislation. But they were the most deeply rooted in Darwinism. Clearly, this is a basically Darwinian argument. This is about what future generations will look like given uneven probabilities of surviving and reproducing. But now let's focus on the Americans, led by Charles Davenport, whose major book on the subject came out same year as Franz Boas's The Mind of Primitive Man, but came to very different conclusions. And Charles Davenport tells us that poverty is the result of a brain that's only running in third gear instead of in fourth. And the gear your brain is in is genetic. Barring a few highly exceptional conditions, poverty means relative inefficiency, he tells us, and this in turn usually means mental inferiority. Okay, so what did you learn in genetics class today? I learned that poverty means innate mental inferiority. And what is the basis of this innate mental inferiority, you might ask? Davenport explains, it's the allele for feeble-mindedness. In the same way that Gregor Mendel worked with binary traits in peas, tall and short, wrinkled and round, green and yellow, there's two kinds of people, smart and stupid. The stupid people have the gene for feeble-mindedness, which is mostly found in poor people and in people not from Northwest Europe. And how can you identify people with this gene for certain? Well, I'm glad you asked me that. They have easily recognizable phenotypes. The act of taking and keeping loose articles, of tearing away obstructions to get at something desired, of picking valuables out of holes and pockets, of assaulting a neighbor who has something desirable or who has caused pain or who is in the way, of deserting family and other relatives, and of course of promiscuous sexual relations. And this genetic theory is also an evolutionary theory, explains Davenport. The traits of the feeble-minded and criminalistic are normal traits for infants and for an earlier stage in man's evolution. Apparently, Davenport believed that Homo erectus was a species of pickpockets. But this is most fundamentally about science in the modern age. We dream of a rational society. And Davenport wants people to be more rational. The problem with human society is primitive irrationality. He tells us the general program of the eugenicist is clear. It is to improve the race by inducing young people to make a more reasonable selection of marriage mates, to fall in love intelligently. Now, how stupid is that? The most important thing here is that humans do not mate indiscriminately. They have criteria, they have circumstances. He just doesn't like those criteria and circumstances. He wants you to mate by his criteria. There is so much to unpack here. Egotism, elitism, puritanism, a lot of isms. But let's focus on scientism. The idea that science should be deciding everything, including who you should fall in love with. Does anyone really want this asshole meddling in your love life? Now remember that the British eugenicists are dubious about real Mendelism, and this guy over in the colonies is mixing eugenics with quack Mendelism. So they go after him, both in scholarly forums and in the New York Times. English expert attacks American eugenics work. Teachings are pronounced fallacious and actually dangerous to social welfare. English eugenics expert again attacks Davenport. Dr. Heron accuses head of the American Eugenics Record Office of carelessness, inconsistency, and misinformation, and says that the following of its advice would mean the death of eugenics as a science. Well, after somebody calls you a quack twice in the pages of the New York Times, you'd think that would be the end of your academic career. But in fact, it wasn't, not by a long shot. Charles Davenport remains the head of the American eugenics movement and the most powerful and influential human geneticist in America. His views are normative, as well as self-interested, for American geneticists. Edward M. East, a professor in Harvard University, tells us there are at least 20 million people in the United States. By the way, in 1927, the population of the United States was 120 million, so that represents 1 in every 6 people in the United States. There are at least 20 million people in the United States, and a similar proportion in other countries, whose nervous systems are too defective for them to appreciate what is demanded of them in a modern society. This goodly quota of irresponsibles are such because of their heredity. Their children will tend to be like them, and I do not see that anything satisfactory biologically can be done about it. Now, let's just focus on that last false statement. It's one thing to say that poor people are genetically dumb, that economic hierarchies are the result of natural stratification, but it's quite another to say that there's nothing that can be done about it. Now, in America in the 1920s, we're talking about 2 large classes of prolific genetically dumb people, namely poor white trash and new immigrants arriving in ridiculously large numbers. Of course, 100 years ago, the immigrants we were worried about were not Hindus, but Catholics and Jews. Now, we already had poor black people and poor Irish people in large numbers, but not in the concentrated urban slums like we have now in 1910. Those people at least spoke English. These people don't even speak English. And they live 20 to a room in unsanitary conditions with typhus and tuberculosis and smells and crime and roaches and rats, and they breed like flies, and half the time they don't even pay their rent. What's a slumlord to do? Slumlord's got to pay the bills. Slumlord can't even get a tax write-off because there is no income tax yet. So to avoid asking the question, why are there slums? What's the matter with this city? You ask, what's the matter with the people who live in the slums? So the science of genetics has identified the cause of the social problems we face and offers a solution. What then should we do about this genetic problem? 1, we need to prevent more genetically feeble-minded poor people from coming into the country. And 2, we need to prevent the genetically feeble-minded poor who are already here from breeding. By 1927, both of those goals will have been accomplished. If you took a course in genetics in college in the 1920s, this is what you would be taught. Even under the most favorable surroundings, there would still be a great many individuals who are always on the borderline of self-supporting existence and whose contribution to society is so small that the elimination of their stock would be beneficial. Now, this is the first edition of a very popular textbook of genetics. Interestingly, the next edition did not contain this statement. In fact, the next edition did not contain this entire chapter on eugenics. The second edition was 1932. What happened in between 1925 and 1932? Well, the market crashed and everyone's stock was eliminated. That was in 1929. And the junior author L.C. Dunn, who became a big mouse geneticist and anti-Nazi geneticist, had a handicapped son, and perhaps began to rethink some of the things that he had said earlier about human value. But surely, you insist, we must have some scientific evidence to show that feeble-mindedness is hereditary and innate. And indeed, that evidence was readily available. The study we're about to review was cited in psychology and genetics textbooks for the next 30 or so years. We're going to look at a family in two halves, one half good, wealthy, industrious, and the other half lazy, criminal, and antisocial. We're going to call this family the Kallikaks, merging the Greek words for beautiful, kalos, and ugly, kakos. So this is the beautiful, ugly family. Let's start with Deborah Kallikak at her sewing machine in 1910. First of all, which side of the family do you think she came from? Time's up. She's a manual laborer. That means she's from the ugly side. Here's the family history. Once upon a time, during the Revolutionary War, there was a young man named Martin Kallikak. Martin did not see any shooting action during the war, but did get some action in taverns. At one point, he had a dalliance with a nameless, feeble-minded tavern girl. Those are the exact words in the study. And later on, he married a young, pious Quaker woman named Rachel. Nameless, feeble-minded tavern girl got pregnant from their dalliance, and through her he had 480 descendants. 143 were feeble-minded, only 46 were normal, the rest were unknown or doubtful. 33 sexually immoral, 24 were alcoholics, 3 epileptics, 82 died in infancy, 3 criminal, 8 ran houses of ill fame. That's a lot of really crappy descendants. Through his Quaker wife, Rachel, he had 496 descendants, all normal, none feeble-minded, none illegitimate. 15 died in infancy, 3 somewhat degenerate but not defective, 2 alcoholics, both doctors, 1 sexually loose. There were doctors, lawyers, judges, educators, traders, landholders, in short, respectable citizens, men and women prominent in every phase of social life. From one side of the family, you got people like Blutarsky from Animal House. On the other side of the family, you get people like J. Edgar Hoover. Here is the argument. The people on the left are a burden on society. If only we had just killed that nameless, feeble-minded tavern girl when we had the chance. Okay, not killed, maybe just sterilized her. If we had just sterilized her, she would not have had those 480 descendants for us to take care of. So this is a story of an ounce of genetic prevention being worth a pound of social cure. It's a simple cost-benefit analysis. So you're probably asking yourself, how are they able to do such detailed studies on people who lived in various times and places? Well, fortunately, even though it sounds like they did IQ tests and pencil and paper exams for a whole bunch of people, actually, many of the assessments could be made just on the spot. So here's a quotation from the actual study by psychologist Henry Goddard. The father, a strong, healthy, broad-shouldered man, was sitting helplessly in a corner. The mother, a pretty woman, still with remnants of ragged garments drawn about her, sat in a chair, the picture of despondency. 3 children, scantily clad and with shoes that would barely hold together, stood about with drooping jaws and the unmistakable look of the feeble-minded. Another child, neither more intelligent nor better clad, was attempting to wash a few greasy dishes in cold water. The deaf boy was nowhere to be seen. On being urgently requested, the mother went out of the room to get him, for he was not yet out of bed. A glance sufficed to establish his mentality, which was low. The father himself, though strong and vigorous, showed by his face that he had only a child's mentality. Okay, so they were doing snap assessments of IQ based on visual inspection. In fact, you might reasonably say to yourself, how did they know that that nameless, feeble-minded tavern girl in the 18th century was in fact feeble-minded when they did not even know her name? That's a reasonable question, and it was asked at the time. Nevertheless, this study carried a great deal of authority in showing the genetic basis of intelligence, law-abidingness, and good standing in the community. The possibility that starting out as an illegitimate son of a tavern girl might have had something to do with the future of that lineage is, of course, irrelevant. Here is a psychology textbook 40 years later, citing this shit as serious evidence that poverty and crime are innate and constitutional. How badly do you think this author wished it were true? But let's return to the 20s. With scientific evidence for the innate basis of crime, the knowledge that poverty is linked to that innate basis, and there's a lot of poor people here now and coming in, Congress is going to act. And the first thing they do is restrict immigration of inferior races, not just from Asia, but from Europe as well. You see, there were European immigrants, and there are European immigrants. As Charles Davenport explains, Germans are, as a rule, thrifty, intelligent, and honest. They have a love of art and music, including that of songbirds, and they have formed one of the most desirable classes of our immigrants. That, by the way, is Marlene Dietrich, film star of the 1930s, and this, of course, was before we fought 2 world wars against them. I should remark also that I know plenty of Germans, and they're no more interested in songbirds than anybody else is. Well, now that you know what Charles Davenport thought about Germans, you might be asking yourself, what did he think about Jews? Well, here's what he thought about Jews. There is no question that, taken as a whole, the hordes of Jews that are now coming to us from Russia and the extreme southeast of Europe, with their intense individualism and ideals of gain at the cost of any interest, represent the opposite extreme from the early English and more recent Scandinavian immigration, with their ideals of community life in the open country, advancement by the sweat of the brow, and the uprearing of families in the fear of God and the love of country. I want to make it clear that he's entitled to his social prejudices. The problem is that this appears in a college textbook about genetics. The eugenicists, the scientists, are inscribing their social and political values into their science and then reading them back out to their students as science. So, informed by the latest science, Congress passes the Johnson-Reed Immigration Restriction Act, and the Europeans that it targets are specifically Southern and Eastern Europeans, which is code for Jews and Italians. And there is Johnson, circled in red as a member of the large advisory council of the American Eugenics Society in 1927. And along with him, in blue, are pretty much every geneticist of prominence in America, save one, Thomas Hunt Morgan from Columbia. The point is that this is not a pseudo-scientific movement. This is very much a mainstream scientific movement. But the people who are scientists are not very critical of the other people on the page with them. For example, A.E. Wiggum, who is a writer, a science popularizer. And in his 1924 exposition of eugenics, The Fruit of the Family Tree, he is relentlessly Mendelian. Intelligent, wholesome, sane, energetic, moral people have more factors in their germ cells for these virtues than have the unintelligent, the immoral, neurotic, and stupid. The point is that the mainstream genetics community doesn't feel that a statement like this misrepresents them. They don't think this makes them look bad. They think it makes them look good. Eugenics was also going to cure cancer. Dr. Maud Sly of the University of Chicago, who apparently was a prominent early woman mouse geneticist, even though she had the name of a cartoon villain, explained how that will come to pass. Since cancer is caused by a single gene, all we need to do is basically give me the power to control who can marry and who can reproduce, like I have over my mice, and I will get rid of cancer in a few generations. The implication, of course, being if you don't give me absolute control, then cancer will still be around, and it will be your own damn fault. The eugenics movement in the 1920s was a very successful program of public education in science. At every state or county fair, there would be a eugenics exhibit there to explain the principles of Mendelian genetics to the public and explain why the poor needed to be sterilized. At the fair, you could enter your family into the Fitter Families contest, and if your family was healthy enough, prolific enough, educated enough, abstemious enough, wealthy enough, and white enough, you could win this medallion that says, "Yea, I have a goodly heritage." I carry mine around with me. It was handed down to me by my grandfather, who stole it. The moral question generally falls on this man, Madison Grant, bearing the names of not just one, but two presidents. His book, The Passing of the Great Race, is a classic of American racist thought. Grant was educated at Yale, did law school at Columbia, but being independently wealthy, he didn't have to work for a living and consequently devoted himself to both wildlife conservation and to the welfare of the Nordic race. His argument is that all civilizations everywhere in the world are the result of white people, but not just white people, but Nordic white people. So there are Nordic people from China to Peru creating civilizations. And as they interbreed with the locals, the civilization they built declines. So this is like history, but not exactly history. It's imaginary genetic history. Here is a famous passage from the book. A rigid system of selection through the elimination of those who are weak or unfit, in other words, social failures, would enable us to get rid of the undesirables who crowd our jails, hospitals, and insane asylums. Sterilization can be applied to an ever-widening circle of social discards, beginning always with the criminal, the diseased, and the insane, and extending gradually to types which may be called weaklings rather than defectives, and perhaps ultimately to worthless race types. It would be a mistake to call Madison Grant a Nazi, because this is 1916, and there are no Nazis yet. Meanwhile, Madison Grant gets fan mail from various politicians, like Teddy Roosevelt, who was a friend of his from the American Museum of Natural History, and from the Bronx Zoo. They were both founders. And Theodore Roosevelt wrote to him, "This book is a capital book, in purpose, in vision, in grasp of the facts our people must need to realize. It is the work of an American scholar and gentleman, and all Americans should be sincerely grateful to you for writing it. Bully!" And then a little bit later, he gets a fan note from Hitler, "Your book is my Bible." What's interesting about this is that you'd like to think there are very few things Theodore Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler could sit down at a table and agree on. But this is one of them. This is a scientific solution to urban problems in 1916. Okay, maybe politicians like the book, you may say, but certainly the scientific community saw right through it. No, the geneticists have no problem with Madison Grant and his bullshit genetic history. His book was reviewed in Science in 1918 by a geneticist from MIT who wrote, "Madison Grant's recent success is sufficiently justified, since he has written both boldly and attractively, and has produced a work of solid merit. This is a book that will do much to widen the rapidly expanding interest in eugenics and help to disseminate the ever-growing conviction among scientific men of the supreme importance of heredity." Two things he's saying here. One, the book is not that bad. And two, if you're a geneticist, you might find some things to disagree with. But it's in your interest. Madison Grant is saying the work you're doing is the most important work out there. Let him say it. It's good for business. Madison Grant doesn't live to see the end of World War II. When he dies in 1937, the New York Times obituary for him tells us that he saved the redwood trees. Meanwhile, the Germans are admiring what's going on in America. As early as 1928, the Germans start getting interested in eugenics. This is, of course, after the United States is already restricting immigration and involuntarily sterilizing citizens. After the Nazis take over in 1933, not only do the German universities begin catching up to the American universities teaching about eugenics, but they very explicitly follow Madison Grant and his ideas. And he bragged about it. It would be interesting to know what Madison Grant made of the ultimate German use of his ideas. After all, remember, this was the guy who was talking about what should be done with worthless race types. Of course, he didn't say anybody should be killed. But here's an important takeaway lesson. The argument that people are not fit to reproduce is exactly the same argument that they are not fit to live. And there will always be financial pressure. It will always be cheaper, easier, and quicker to kill people instead of operate on them, once you've decided that their lives are less meaningful, less valuable than others. To which the only reasonable answer, then and now, is, who the fuck are you to be making that judgment? And that question is worth remembering. You'll hear it again. Finally, in the war crime trials in Nuremberg after World War II, a doctor named Karl Brandt was accused of war crimes and read into the record for his defense a long excerpt from The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant, which Hitler had read in jail because it was translated into German in 1923. By the way, that's why he wrote Madison Grant, saying the book was his Bible. But the point here was to argue that the Germans had just done what the Americans were talking about 20 or 30 years previously. It didn't work. They hanged him anyway. The other thing that needed fixing was the reproductive rate of the poor white trash. Surely you must be thinking the Supreme Court would not allow the involuntary sterilization of its citizens. But they've been hearing from science. And in 1927, they hear the case of Carrie Buck, a poor, stupid white woman in Virginia, who was the daughter of a poor, stupid white woman, and just had a baby who is destined to be a poor, stupid white woman. Faced with the obvious conclusion that the world would be better off without her, 8 rich old white men, led by Oliver Wendell Holmes, decreed, in the memory of the First World War, Carrie Buck is a feeble-minded white woman who is the daughter of a feeble-minded mother in the same institution, and the mother of an illegitimate feeble-minded child. We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often felt not to be such by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That's a famous line. And that was an 8-1 decision. The one dissenting vote coming from the conservative Catholic on the bench named Pierce Butler. Interesting side note about the 3rd generation of imbeciles, the baby named Vivian Buck. She was taken away and adopted by a family named Dettamore, and she died of influenza at a young age. Paul Lombardo was able to track down her report cards from elementary school. She was a B student. I'll say that again. She was a B student and judged to be an imbecile by scientists in one of the most important political decisions in our nation's history. Think about that as you contemplate your own GPA. Since it was now constitutional for states to sterilize citizens against their will, many states, around 30, began to enact such laws. But now let's talk about the resistance. The political left already knew of a very real genetic disability that was rampant in the ruling houses of Europe, namely hemophilia, in which your blood is unable to clot properly and so you bleed to death readily. Queen Victoria in Generation 3 was a carrier, and although she kept the English monarchy free of the disease, she passed it on to the ruling houses of Germany, Russia, and Spain. So here you had good evidence of genetic transmission of a very debilitating and very real medical condition. Yet no one was talking about sterilizing them. Clearly this had a lot more to do with class differences than it had to do with genetic scientific realities. Meanwhile, let's pause briefly in 1925. Tennessee has passed a law prohibiting the teaching of evolution, and the town of Dayton, Tennessee volunteers itself to the ACLU to provide a test case, and they duly arrest a local substitute school teacher named John Scopes for the ostensible crime of teaching evolution. Then William Jennings Bryan, leading orator and political icon in the country, three-time Democratic candidate for president, and a fundamentalist Christian, volunteers to assist the prosecution. At which point the leading trial attorney in the land, Clarence Darrow, volunteers for the defense. And this is suddenly the trial of the century. The trial of John T. Scopes in July of 1925 was a huge media circus, pitting the values of urban, cosmopolitan, progressive America against the values of rural, southern Christian fundamentalists. Not only that, but it was broadcast on the radio, so the whole nation heard it. Creationism and the Bible and tradition versus evolution and modernity and progress. Spoiler alert, Scopes was found guilty, and then the verdict was overturned on appeal. But Clarence Darrow has actually done something radical. He sat down and he read the textbook out of which Scopes was accused of teaching evolution. And what he found there appalled him even more than it appalled the creationists. Sure, the book has photosynthesis and anatomy and botany and evolution, and after evolution it goes into sterilizing the poor and good old-fashioned white supremacy. The poor take from society. They are true parasites. If such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. This is in the biology textbook that he's just been defending. And it gets worse. At the present time, there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from the other in instinct, social customs, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro race originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the natives of China, Japan, and the Eskimos, and finally the highest type of all, the Caucasian, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. And Darrow gets very unhappy. He does want high school students taught evolution. He doesn't want them taught this. He knows that we simultaneously inhabit a naturalistic universe of ape ancestry and a symbolic cultural universe of inequality and injustice. And somehow the biologists are acknowledging the former, but not the latter. And that is a moral problem for science. And immediately after the trial, Clarence Darrow starts attacking the eugenics movement. And the very same biologists whose ideas about extinct fish he had just been defending, he now attacks for their ideas about living people. Amongst the schemes for remolding society, this is the most senseless and impudent that has ever been put forward by irresponsible fanatics to plague a long-suffering race. Darrow published this in a literary magazine edited by his friend, the writer H.L. Mencken. Mencken himself was also critical of the eugenicists. As Mencken wrote in 1927, probably the wisest assessment of overall human value. There may be at the very top a small class of persons whose blood is decidedly superior and distinguished, and there may be at the bottom another class whose blood is almost wholly debased, but both are very small. The folks between are all pretty much alike. Here's the thing, though. This criticism is coming from a journalist and a lawyer, not from scientists. Within the scientific community, eugenics was a mainstream voice. If you opposed eugenics, the first thing they accused you of was being anti-science, and the second thing they accused you of was being anti-evolution. In a significant sense, you were being both. Franz Boas, the founder of academic anthropology in the U.S., positioned anthropology explicitly against eugenics as early as 1911, on the ground that class differences are historical, not biological. Thomas Hunt Morgan, who was the only American geneticist not to align himself with eugenics, worked in the same building as Boas at Columbia. It is very possible that some of the most important conversations in the history of human genetics took place in the John at Schermerhorn Hall at Columbia. The people who actually publicly opposed eugenics in the 1920s had to position themselves as anti-science, and they were a weird coalition. First, you have a social scientist like Franz Boas, who could see that the geneticists were fundamentally misunderstanding the social basis of crime and poverty. Next, you have the civil libertarians like Clarence Darrow, who didn't like the idea of the state intruding upon private matters. Third, you have the Catholics, who were opposed to human interference with the divine business of reproduction. The Lamarckians, who still thought there was a place for the external world to influence how organisms turn out. And finally, you had political conservatives, because eugenics was in fact a progressive political movement. They wanted to change the country and the world for the better scientifically. That's literally what conservatives are against. And the people who were for eugenics? Mendel, Darwin, science. You won't find a single biologist in America speaking out critically of the eugenics movement until 1927, when it's too late. In 1927, once again, in the literary magazine edited by H.L. Mencken, another one of his friends, the biologist Raymond Pearl from Johns Hopkins, becomes the first biologist to say publicly that eugenics is kind of screwy. And his criticism is so devastating that a biologist is actually breaking ranks, and it gets picked up by the wire services. Like not produced by like, biologist says in attacking eugenics. Eugenics all wrong about better babies, savant finds. But of course, criticizing the power structure comes with risks. As it happens, Harvard had been courting Raymond Pearl from Johns Hopkins, and abruptly stopped courting him after this article came out. By the mid-1930s, eugenics in America was on the decline, for basically three reasons. First, it had more or less attained its political goals. Immigration of inferior stocks was curtailed, and the states could now sterilize the poor. Yay! But it didn't seem to be doing any good. Things were worse than ever, because of the second thing, the Great Depression, which convinced a lot of scientists of something the rest of the world already knew, namely that the difference between wealth and poverty has very little to do with your genes. And third, the Nazis seemed to like it a little too much, and they were clearly evil. There was in fact a spectrum of ideas that the eugenics movement brought into popular circulation, ranging from the extremes of sterilization and abortion through birth control and the proper family composition for raising a child. In January of 1928, a wealthy left-wing widow decided she wanted a baby more than another husband, and she conceived a child with her best friend's husband and consent. And she checked into the hospital, and where she's supposed to sign the name of the father, She invents a name, Carl Graham, Carl being the first name of a social theorist that she admired, and Graham being a contraction of her own name, Grace Burnham. And her scandalized in-laws tell the newspapers that she has deliberately chosen to have a eugenic baby because she has carefully selected the father for his good genes. And the New York tabloids go crazy with this story. Mrs. Burnham's baby was the subject of a public referendum on non-traditional family structure, on the privileges of wealth, on whether eugenics is really about good genes or about money, about the rights of women, and about the relationships among love, sex, and marriage. A very different conversation from the issues about eugenics concerning the lower classes. For what it's worth, Mrs. Burnham drops off the map after a few weeks, moves west, gets remarried, and changes her name to MacDonald, and becomes a wealthy supporter of left-wing causes and a labor organizer. The baby ended up with a PhD in sociology from Stanford and had a nice life, too. And the story of Ann Cooper Hewitt brings the economic classes together. Ann Cooper Hewitt was, I guess, something like Paris Hilton. In her day, they called her a freewheeling heiress. Now we might just call her a rich hoe. In Ann Cooper Hewitt's father's will, if she's childless, then her money goes to her mother. Ann Cooper Hewitt goes in for an appendectomy in 1934, and her mother says to the doctor, "Hey, as long as you're in there, she's feeble-minded. Why don't you cut her fallopian tubes? Here's a few extra grand for your troubles." And they say, sure. Well, Ann Cooper Hewitt was smart enough to sue her mother, which again led to a public referendum on exactly who is feeble-minded, on family structure, on the value of having two parents of different sexes if one of them is the mother from hell, greed and dishonor in the wealthy classes, and the power of heredity. And all it takes is for them to start sterilizing rich people against their will. So at the end of World War II, the science of human genetics essentially had to reinvent itself and create a disconnect between the pre-World War II past and post-World War II present. And it reinvents itself as genetic counseling, and its services are now voluntary rather than coercive. The goal of genetic counseling is no longer the imaginary health of the race or nation, but the actual welfare of the family. And the focus of genetic counseling is no longer imaginary social problems like feeble-mindedness, but real medical problems like sickle cell anemia and Tay-Sachs disease. Moreover, they cast out Charles Davenport and replace him with a new founder, Archibald Garrod, who had rarely been cited prior to World War II, and the field of bioethics begins to develop in reaction to the eugenics of both America in the 1920s and Germany in the 1930s. Of course, however, the story doesn't end there. About 30 states had enacted involuntary sterilization laws, and they began to phase them out. There is no clear pattern. This is not sorting out as Northern versus Southern. This is not sorting out as Republican versus Democrat or rich state versus poor state. New York had a sterilization law. Kansas had a sterilization law. Utah had a sterilization law. Illinois did not have a sterilization law. Of the states that had sterilization laws, many did not enforce them seriously. For example, New York only sterilized 42 people over the course of several decades. But some states took them very seriously, with California leading the way. But only one state actually accelerated their sterilizations after World War II, and that was North Carolina. There are a lot of threads to pull on in a conversation about eugenics. So let's wind down with 4 myths. Number 1, it was just the Nazis. No, the Nazis just took it to its logical extreme. Number 2, it was just a pseudoscience. Well, how could it be a pseudoscience if it was exactly what the scientists and the majority of the scientific community were saying? The people who were criticizing it prior to 1927 were the ones shouted down as pseudoscientists. Number 3, that it was science misused somehow by the state. No, it was science used by the state in exactly the ways that the scientists themselves had wanted it to be used. And finally, it's a myth that it ended after World War II. The two principles of eugenics, that there is a hierarchy of human value, and that imposing a reduction in the reproductive rate of the lower rungs is good, are both false. We know how to lower the reproductive rate. Let women enter the workforce. And universally, the reproductive rate goes down, as if by magic. And of course, whether the world would have been a better place without Martin Kallikak is debatable. But I'm pretty sure the world would have been a much better place if Madison Grant and Charles Davenport had never been born. The fellow on the left there, being interviewed for 60 Minutes, was sent as a child in 1949 to the Fernald School for the Feeble-Minded outside of Boston. He was sent there as a familial moron, which was a bureaucratic way of saying a poor orphan. At the school, he was abused, he was uneducated, he was untrained. At one point, the government was interested in finding out whether there would be any effects from eating radioactive food after a nuclear war. So one day the children at the school were given a fabulous treat that they never got, a big bowl of cornflakes for breakfast, which unbeknownst to them had been nuked. And they were part of a little experiment to see whether nuking cornflakes would have an adverse effect on children. Fortunately, it did not. In 1961, the boys at the Fernald School revolted and held off the Boston police for 3 days. This suggested to the Boston police that they might not be so feeble-minded after all. And shortly thereafter, the Fernald School for the Feeble-Minded was shut down. Mr. Boas there worked hard, read books, got a normal life, got married, became a businessman, and then successfully sued the state of Massachusetts for what it had done to him. But the interesting thing about this story is that it begins and ends after the Nazis, after World War II. And if you're interested in this story, there's a nice book about it, The State Boys Rebellion by Michael Antonio. And finally, every so often, an ideologue or an idiot brings up the idea of mass sterilizations of people they don't think should be reproducing. In this case, a Norwegian philosopher brought it up, and I had recently given a lecture on this very subject in Oslo. And the journalist contacted me. It's not like I speak Norwegian. But the journalist translated what I said in this call-out. The first question in eugenics is simple. Who the fuck are you to be deciding who is fit to reproduce? What qualifies you to make such judgments? What is the basis of your judgment, O wise one? You don't think poor people should breed? Remove barriers to upward mobility. Duh.